4 games into the season. Pretty decent so far for the Jets. How do they keep it going? That's what we'll talk about today on the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Tuesday, October 4th, 2022, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com, thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free, and it's available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening. You'll never miss an episode. If you happen to be watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps the channel out, and it helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Well, we are 4 weeks into the 2022 season. The Jets have now gotten through the AFC North. Kind of an interesting scheduling quirk this year. The Jets played their first month against the 4 teams of the AFC North. I remember when the schedule came out, I figured the NFL must be doing something this year where you play an entire division your first 4 weeks, because that's what the Jets had. And then I looked around, and I do not think any other team had a schedule like that. When it came out, there was a lot of concern because the AFC North was projected to be a very tough division this year. There were cases people made for all 4 teams making the playoffs. At the time, I felt like it was not as bad as people were making it out to be. Week 1, Baltimore, I felt like it was good the Jets had extra time to prepare for that game. Of course, it did them no good. Week 2, Cleveland, no Deshaun Watson early in the season. Week 3, Cincinnati, I always felt was going to be a tough game. But Week 4, Pittsburgh, you knew you were going to be facing either Mitchell Trubisky or Kenny Pickett very early in his career. And in fact, the Jets got both in that game. And really the key was getting through it 2-2. And then when Zach Wilson got hurt in preseason, we all thought he was going to be back originally, but then the Jets told us he was going to be out 3 weeks. I think most of us would have signed up for 1-2 with Joe Flacco. So the Jets have survived this early part of the season, which is really important because, as I've mentioned the last couple of days here on the podcast, they have been out of the race really early in recent seasons. 2015 was really the last time they were playing meaningful games near the end of the season. I mean, forget about not making the playoffs since 2010. They really have not been legitimately in the playoff race since 2015. In fact, the best season record-wise during that stretch was 2019 when they went 7-9, and that team really was not a 7-9 caliber team. It was one of the worst teams in the NFL that just kind of got hot, caught some lucky breaks, and had a very favorable schedule. But even that 7-9, most of the time you go 7-9 in this league. Of course, you can't do that anymore because there are 17 games. But most of the time, if you're in the 7-win range, you were in the playoff mix in November and December. But the Jets really were not that year because they began the season 1-7. So as much as anything this year, and it's a very low bar, but the Jets want to be relevant. The Jets want to be playing relevant football as we get deeper into the season. And they've set themselves up through 4 weeks. Now they have to continue to play well. They have to continue to win games. It's nice to talk about the Jets winning games for once. How do they do that? What do they need to happen? And that's what we're going to talk about on today's episode. And I think it goes without saying, number one, Zach Wilson can continue to develop. You have to be happy with what you saw Sunday from Zach Wilson. Leading the fourth quarter comeback against the Pittsburgh Steelers, first game back, not really showing any signs of issues with the injury. It seemed like he was moving very well after he suffered that knee injury preseason against the Philadelphia Eagles. In fact, I think he did a very good job avoiding sacks. The Steelers had a lot of pressure on him in that game. Not surprising because of all the injuries the Jets have suffered along the offensive line. His movement skills. I mean, that's what jumped out to me as the thing that was most improved this year. Because last year it felt like he did not really know what he was doing in the pocket. His movements were not very good. It's not that he had an inability to move. It's that he did not know where to move. And in this game, he kind of even understood how to bait defenders, how to make them go one way and then fake the other way and evade them. I thought it was really, I was really encouraged by his pocket movements because I felt like that was one of the weak points of his game last year. So I want to see him continue to build on that. Beyond that, there's a lot that needs to be worked on. This was not a perfect performance by Zach Wilson. It was a good performance. It was a performance that was really encouraging. And if you had asked me on Sunday morning, would I sign up for that kind of performance? The answer would be absolutely, because he delivered a win. And he was the star down the stretch for the Jets in that game. Jets don't win that game with Joe Flacco. I'm pretty convinced of that. So you can build on some things. And listen, we know Zach Wilson's potential. He was drafted second overall. There are some things he needs to work on, and some of these things will come with time. I think chemistry with receivers, there are some new receivers on this team, particularly Garrett Wilson. Garrett Wilson, made a few plays in this game. It's not like Garrett Wilson was completely shut out, but Wilson was working a lot with the twos in training camp, and then, of course, Zach Wilson missed the early part of this season. So I think in time he and Garrett Wilson will develop some chemistry, but that's something clearly to work on. It felt like the chemistry was a little bit better with Elijah Moore. Last year, that was a connection that really was not there. And then Corey Davis, of course, as well. Beyond that, I think Zach Wilson, he needs to get more comfortable making reads. Now, I felt like the reads in this game were a step up from where they were a year ago. But I think there were still some moments he got fooled. And, a lot of this stuff is just basic young quarterback material in the NFL. Every quarterback, when they first enter the league, they don't really know what they're looking at defensively. They're seeing all these looks they've never seen before. Defenses are trying to fool them. I mean, I got to tell you, even when I'm watching games on film, and I'm not an NFL quarterback, so, take this for what it's worth, but even when I watch the film, frequently what I have to do is I have to watch it 3 or 4 times to figure out what the defense is doing. Quarterbacks have to figure this out in real time. They have to pretty much diagnose all of this in less than 3 seconds. It's not easy. And I felt like the quality of Zach Wilson's reads was better in this game than we saw a year ago. So, I think you saw progress, but there were some mistakes. There were clearly some mistakes. There were a few moments where he did not pick up what he needed to pick up quickly enough. And again, I'm not trying to be overly critical here, because a lot of this stuff is just basic young quarterback development. It's not anything that any other young quarterback would not have to do. But there were a couple plays where he got away with a couple of throws in this game. There was one he threw into double coverage to Michael Carter that fell incomplete. There was one where, ball probably should have been picked off, where it was a bit of an errant throw. It is funny how these things even out, because one of the 2 interceptions he threw, I felt like he had minimal responsibility. I mean, you could put maybe 5 to 10% on him for a little bit off target pass to Tyler Conklin to hit Conklin in the hands, and ended up being an interception. But that one really wasn't his fault. However, he did get away with a couple of other throws, and I think one of the things you find in this league is things do tend to even out. The quarterback position, you always get the blame when there's an interception. It's not always entirely your fault, but you also have some that probably could or should have been intercepted that you get away with. So you'd like to see him cut down on those throws. You'd like to see him continue to improve making reads. I guess that's the right way to put it, because again, I don't want to be overly critical of Zach's performance in this game, and I don't want to be overly critical of a quarterback who's got less than 17 games of starting experience under his belt. But you'd like to see that improve, and you'd like to see the decision making improve. I go back to what I just said. Zach, even going back to his time at BYU, there were not a lot of interceptions that last season at BYU, but if you watch those games closely, you could see that there were some very shaky decisions. And bad decisions don't always turn into interceptions, but a bad decision sets into motion a process that could lead to an interception. And even in the Pittsburgh game, this kind of goes hand in hand with what I was just talking about, improving the reads that you're making. But Zach has to do a better job finding the balance between being aggressive and being reckless. Now, in the intermediate zone, he was very effective in this game. His numbers in the intermediate zone were really good. I think that's a very good sign. And last year, it was kind of a tale of 2 seasons for Zach. Early in the season, he wasn't making a ton of plays, but he was also making a lot of mistakes. Late in the season, he stopped making mistakes, but the playmaking that was not great at the early part of the season went down even further. So it's all about finding the right balance. I still think Zach's kind of struggling to find the right balance between being aggressive and being reckless. That game, I think there were a few too many high danger throws. It's I don't think you can play quarterback effectively in this league unless you're like Tom Brady without making any high danger passes, because sometimes you have to try and fit a ball into a tight window. But it's about picking your spots and there are always going to be mistakes. I still feel like the ratio of mistakes in the Pittsburgh game was a little bit too high. Overall, a good performance, though. So all this is to say, I mean, none of this is really that different from what I would be saying about any young quarterback. And at least in this game, we've got some good things to talk about. You had to come away from that game feeling positively about Zach Wilson, and he's got to build on it. We've seen this over and over with Jets quarterbacks in the past, young quarterbacks they've tried to develop, that for that many instances we've seen one step forward and then two steps back the next week. So he needs to follow this up. He needs to stack a couple of good performances together and continue to show growth. But I think by all accounts, really solid debut in 2022, and we'll see if he can build from it. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about some of the other elements, because Zach Wilson's not the only young player on this team who the Jets are looking to develop. Young players have carried the Jets so far this season. Will they continue to grow? That's what we'll continue to discuss here on this Tuesday episode of Locked On Jets. One thing you learn when you cover the NFL is just what amazing condition players are in. You need to be in top shape to succeed in this league. And if you're looking to get into top shape yourself, I want to tell you about Athletic Greens 1. With one delicious scoop of AG1, you're absorbing 75 high-quality vitamins, minerals, whole food source superfoods, probiotics, and adaptogens to help you start your day right. The special blend of ingredients supports your gut health, your nervous system, your immune system, your energy, recovery, focus, and aging. All the things. And it costs less than $3 a day. You're investing in your health, and it's cheaper than your cold brew habit. It's cheaper than getting all the supplements yourself. You're investing in an all-in-one nutritional insurance. And to make it easy, Athletic Greens is going to give you a free 1-year supply of immune-supporting vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. All you have to do is visit athleticgreens.com/NFL Network. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/NFL Network to take ownership over your health and pick up the ultimate daily nutritional insurance. Thank you again for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. The show is free and available on all platforms. And make sure you check out key NFL predictions every Friday on Locked On NFL. Locked On's local experts give you the inside scoop on the 5 biggest games of the NFL weekend, including Sunday and Monday Night Football, plus betting advice from the field's leading experts, BetOnline. Follow NFL key predictions every Friday on Locked On NFL, available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Now, today on Locked On Jets, we're talking about what the Jets need to do to keep it going. 2-2 through the first 4 games. I think that's pretty much what everybody said they needed to do heading into the season in order to keep themselves on track. Young players have been stepping up for the Jets so far this season. Now, it was a quiet performance by Garrett Wilson on Sunday, relatively speaking. He did have a couple key plays, though, but you have to be really encouraged by what you've seen from him. Sauce Gardner continues to be really impressive on the outside at the corner position. So you have 2 rookies so far this year who look like they could be legitimate difference makers, but you're also seeing some other young players come along. Breece Hall, he began the season slowly. I felt like heading into the season, we would begin with Michael Carter as the number 1 back, and then as Breece Hall began to get more comfortable, slowly you'd begin to see him take on the number 1 role. I wonder after Sunday whether he has taken on the number 1 role. And why do I say that? Because in the last minute of that game Sunday, Breece Hall was getting the football. It was not Michael Carter in there. With the game on the line, the Jets gave the ball to Breece Hall, and he responded. He averaged just under 4 yards per carry on a day where the offensive line did not seem like they were doing that great of a job. And another guy, Jermaine Johnson, this rookie class with 4 top 40 picks. Jermaine Johnson's kind of been the guy who's been criticized. There was talk he was having a slow start at training camp. Early in the camp, he was working with the 3rd team. Every time I see this guy on the field, he's looking pretty good. Now, he's not looking like a guy who's going to be a 10-sack rookie player, but you see him make a play or two every single week while he's in there. And for a rookie, I think that's good enough. I think as much as anything, you want to see a rookie look like he belongs. And then you look at some of the other guys. Elijah Vera Tucker, I think, is having a really solid second season with this team and just had a really difficult challenge. Guy who's played guard for 2 years. Guy who moved from the left side to the right side in the offseason, had to move out to left tackle and only had a few days worth of practice to get ready for it. Now, the Jets did not decide to do that Sunday before the game. It came out that they actually had been planning to start Vera Tucker at left tackle all week, but a guy who I think has grown as a guard, forced to play out of position and doing a really solid job. And then you also have Elijah Moore. Now, Is Elijah Moore living up to expectations? Well, it depends on what your expectations were. You never really know what you have in a player like Elijah Moore after year one, where you see flashes, but you don't see it consistently. And it looks more and more like Elijah Moore. Perhaps he's not going to be the star-level talent at the receiver position we've been hoping for, but that doesn't mean he's an enormous disappointment. He's on pace for over 800 yards at the receiver position this year. He's been a presence in, I think, every game so far. And maybe he's not going to be the guy who's going to be the dominant force in this receiving game. It looks more and more like Garrett Wilson might be that go-to guy on offense. But you need supporting players. And Elijah Moore right now, he's on pace for over 800 receiving yards. And if you look at that, that's kind of like high-end second receiver production. That means you have a really good second option. So you're getting a lot from younger players on this team. Michael Clemens is flashing a little bit. He's not the dominant player he was in preseason because he's not going up against third stringers, fourth stringers, practice squad players, guys who aren't even going to be on the practice squad anymore. I think the preseason Michael Clemens had led to some expectations that maybe were not in line with what you can realistically expect from a fourth round pick his rookie season. But the key is that you're getting a lot of production from young players, which is good because you're not getting any production outside of DJ Reed, who's been excellent. But outside of DJ Reed, you're getting like no production from the guys from the veterans you brought in free agency. Whether you want to talk the tight ends, you want to talk. I mean, they're just Laken Tomlinson's not having a good season. The safeties did have a good week last week. The safeties had a very good week, but overall the safety play has been bottom of the league level. So it's an interesting path to 2-2 for the Jets, and I have to say, I would prefer that the veterans were playing well as well. But if you were to ask me before the season, you said, John, we can get to 2-2. It can either be because the veterans Joe Douglas signed are playing well, or it can be because the rookies Joe Douglas drafted are playing well. I choose the young players, and not just the rookies, but the rookies and second-year players Joe Douglas drafted are playing well. I choose the young players every time because they were brought in to be the core of this team. The veterans who were signed in free agency and maybe one or two acquired in trade, they were brought in to be supplementary players. They were brought in to fill holes, and I would rather they both be playing well. I mean, I think it's a big disappointment what the Jets have gotten from or have not gotten from their free agent class this year, but you see a young core developing, and that's what's exciting as much as anything, is that beyond Zach Wilson, you have a guy in Garrett Wilson who looks like he may be a number one receiver, and Elijah Moore, who may not be the go-to guy we were hoping for, but a guy who looks like he could slide right in behind Garrett Wilson as perhaps the number two receiver. Or, and this is the key. I mentioned this a few days ago, how everybody always talks about that 2000 Jets draft class where they drafted 4 players who were good in the first round. Well, one of those players was Anthony Becht, who was really a role player. He was never an impact guy. He was just kind of a competent blocking tight end. But when he's your 4th best player from your draft class, then you're really going places. And the same thing you could say about Jermaine Johnson. Even if Jermaine Johnson never develops into that 10-sack guy, even if he's not that guy, the other team has to game plan around that type of defensive end who can always get to the quarterback. If he can be a good player, if he can be a contributing player, and you get production from everybody else, well, that's a really positive thing for your team. So you're starting to see a young talent really begin to emerge, and that, as much as anything, is the reason the Jets are winning these games. So you want to see this talent continue to develop. You want to see that connection between Zach Wilson and Garrett Wilson continue to grow through the season. You want to see Elijah Moore sustain his production. You want to see Elijah Vera Tucker hopefully slide back to guard at some point and continue to play well. It's growth as much as anything. It's true of Zach Wilson, but it's also true of the other young players on this team. Another guy who just got injured, unfortunately, Sunday, Max Mitchell, who's been not great, but for a 4th-round rookie, I think doing pretty well. Those reps may help him. This was supposed to be a developmental year for Max Mitchell. You can tell he's not there physically yet. He doesn't have the upper body strength yet. This was supposed to be a year where he hits the weight room, adds some bulk. But you have to think that, if nothing else, these reps are not going to hurt him. Unfortunately, Max Mitchell is injured, however. And here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll close out this Tuesday show. We're talking about what the Jets need to have a successful season after a pretty solid first 4 weeks. Well, one thing's beyond their control, and that's just health. We'll talk about it further as we continue this Tuesday episode. Well, if you're the type of fan who likes to bet on the Jets, you're probably pretty happy with what you got on Sunday. Jets face Miami this weekend. They are an underdog, and if you want to put money down on that game, you should know BetOnline.net is your number one source for football betting info this season. You can find all the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth articles and analysis on every game you can find. And as always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all of your sports wagering information with live betting and up-to-the-minute scores for every sport out there. It's the fastest and easiest way to check on all your favorite games and events, including the baseball playoffs, MMA, boxing, and golf. Head to betonline.net or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Tuesday. We're talking about the first 4 weeks and where we go from here. Jets are 2-2. I think heading into the season, almost everybody was signed up for 2-2 after the first 4 weeks. How do they keep it going? Well, we've talked about Zach Wilson's growth. We've talked about the growth of some of the other young players. But in the NFL, I think sometimes we forget. Things are not always within your control. Sometimes you just need the ball to bounce your way. Sometimes you just need good luck. And I think it's fair to say at this point of the season, the Jets have not had great injury luck. And I look at that offensive line where you have your top four tackles are injured. The guys were the top three, I guess, at the beginning of training camp. And then you even brought in Dwayne Brown, who got injured. Jets need better luck injury-wise. This is a team that the talent level's clearly improved. Listen, they're 2-2 right now. You can see that they have players now. I mentioned Garrett Wilson, Sauce Gardner. It looks like you have one difference maker who's a rookie on both sides of the ball. You have other guys beginning to emerge. The 2021 draft class really looking like it's beginning to step up. But this is not a team that has an overwhelming amount of depth. They're not at that phase of the build. They're at the phase where you're starting to see the talent base improve. But in order to become a complete team, in order to be the type of team that's going to compete for a championship, you need to have a lot of depth because injuries happen during the course of the NFL season. But they don't always happen at an equal rate. There are some teams that deal with injuries more than others. And for the Jets to compete this year, because of the still lack of depth overall, now there were some spots where they are fairly deep, but due to the lack of depth overall, you need to have better injury luck. This is an area where the Jets just have not been fortunate. And again, that goes back to the offensive line. And I think there was plenty of nervousness from me and from others about Zach Wilson stepping into the lineup behind an offensive line that we thought was going to include Connor McDermott. Well, now it's going to have to include Connor McDermott because Max Mitchell is out. The word broke yesterday that Max Mitchell is going to be out a couple of weeks. The good news is that it does not sound like a season-ending injury, although with the Jets, you never know because the Jets have not exactly been great at diagnosing these things over the last couple of years. But Zach Wilson's in a tough, it's not easy to have this many injuries, especially on your offensive line. So hopefully the Jets get a little bit of luck. Hopefully they start getting some of these offensive linemen back to protect Zach Wilson. And hopefully they don't suffer injuries everywhere else because an injury in one spot impacts you in other places. An injury at corner means that maybe you can blitz a little bit less. So you want to avoid injuries there. Injury at defensive line makes life more difficult on everybody else on defense. I think sometimes we forget how much an injury at one spot can affect an entire unit. Hopefully the Jets, and this is nothing the Jets can do. It's really just a matter of luck. And the Jets have had plenty of bad injury luck through the years. And I know a lot of people put that on the MetLife turf, which there's probably something to, although the Jets are suffering a lot of these injuries away from home. So you can't blame it all on the turf. You just have to hope that things break their ways. Now, within these games, the Jets have had plenty of luck. I mean, that Cleveland game, the way the Browns approached the last 2 minutes, that was a disaster for Cleveland. The Jets deserve full credit for how they handled the last 2 minutes. It would not have made a difference if the Browns had not messed up the last 2 minutes. And there was a degree of luck in the Pittsburgh game. The Jets had a few bounces go their way, which is nice for once because Jets have had their share of bad luck through the years. So you need luck in games, but the things that are big are injuries. You just can't have the injuries on the offensive line the Jets have had. So maybe it'll be a situation where perhaps the Jets had some bad luck in the early part of the season and things will turn around. Maybe the second half of the year, the Jets will deal with injuries a little bit less. Of course, you have the bye week coming up in a little while, which is always a good time to rest up, get guys healthy. But this one's beyond their control, and you are already seeing it in the NFL how injuries can destroy a season. Sometimes it's just about avoiding them, and there's not really a lot you can do with it. You just have to hope that things bounce your way. Anyway, that's all for our episode today. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day's our motto. Big shout out to subscribers to the podcast. If you want to join that group, just hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please give the episode a big thumbs up. Have a great Tuesday, everybody, and send in your mailbag questions. Tomorrow we will have our weekly mailbag.